Hi there. It's good to be here with you. Tonight, we're exploring a question that has followed humanity for as long as memory itself. Not as a puzzle to solve. Not as a mystery to conquer. But as something softer, something quieter. The idea of what may come after life. This question doesn't arrive with urgency. It doesn't demand answers. It simply appears, gently, when the world slows down. Often at night. Often in moments of stillness. You may notice how easily the mind drifts toward it when everything else becomes quiet. When there's no noise to respond to. No role to play. Just awareness, resting with itself. Across cultures, across centuries, across belief systems, humans have paused here. Not because death feels threatening. But because life feels meaningful. When something matters deeply, the mind wonders where it goes when it changes form. And that wondering, at its core, is not fear. It's connection. From the earliest gatherings around firelight, people have told stories about continuity. Not stories of endings, but of movement. Of transition. Of something gently carrying on. Not because they knew. But because imagining continuity felt natural. You might notice how the mind does this effortlessly. How it reaches for softness instead of absence. How it prefers flow over silence. This isn't weakness. It's design. The human mind evolved to understand the world through patterns. Through cycles. Through rhythms that repeat and transform. Day becomes night. Breath becomes pause. Wakefulness becomes rest. Nothing in nature truly stops. It only changes its shape. And so, when the mind turns toward the question of life after death, it's often not searching for certainty. It's searching for harmony. A way to place the unknown gently within what already feels familiar. Tonight, there's no expectation to believe anything. No direction to arrive somewhere specific. No conclusion waiting at the end. This is simply a calm exploration. An open one. We'll look at how humans have understood this question across time. How science approaches the edge of it without forcing answers. How philosophy holds it carefully. And how, sometimes, not knowing can feel just as peaceful as knowing. There is no need to hurry. No need to decide. No need to resolve anything. You may find that curiosity here doesn't feel sharp. It feels round. Spacious. Almost comforting. Like watching waves arrive and recede without counting them. As we move forward, ideas may appear and drift away again. You don't need to hold on to them. If something resonates, it can stay for a while. If not, it can pass quietly. This space is safe for wondering. Safe for openness. Safe for rest. And as the night holds us, we can let the question exist without pressure. What follows is not about answers. It's about understanding how humans have lived with this question, gently, for a very long time. And as we begin, you may notice something subtle. The more softly we approach the unknown, the less it asks of us. Just listening. Just presence. Just curiosity, without weight. And from here, we can begin. Long before there were written records. Long before theories or institutions or explanations. Humans were already living with the idea that life does not simply vanish. We know this not from words. But from what was left behind. Burial sites from tens of thousands of years ago tell a quiet story. Bodies laid carefully in the earth. Objects placed beside them. Flowers. Tools. Traces of color made from natural pigments. These were not practical gestures. They were symbolic ones. They suggest that early humans sensed continuity. That something about a person extended beyond the visible body. Not necessarily as a defined soul, but as presence. As essence. As something that mattered enough to be honored. What's striking is how gentle these early expressions were. There is no evidence of fear-driven urgency. No signs of panic about endings. Instead, there is care. Slowness. Attention. The act of burial itself mirrors sleep. A body placed at rest. A return to the ground. A transition rather than a disappearance. Across early cultures, stories emerged that reflected this same rhythm. Life was often seen as part of a long cycle. Moving through phases the way seasons do. Growth. Maturity. Rest. Renewal. In many traditions, the afterlife wasn't imagined as a distant place. It was woven into the same world. Just beyond ordinary perception. Like night existing within day. Like silence existing within sound. Some cultures spoke of ancestors remaining nearby. Not watching or judging. But accompanying. Present in memory, in landscape, in ritual. Others imagined a journey. Not a test. But a passage. A crossing that required patience rather than courage. What's common across these early visions is not certainty. But familiarity. Death wasn't framed as an enemy. It was treated as a threshold. And thresholds, by their nature, invite pause. You might notice how this mirrors the way the mind approaches sleep. There's often a moment where wakefulness loosens its grip. Thoughts slow. Edges soften. Awareness shifts without effort. Early humans didn't have language for neuroscience or consciousness. But they lived close enough to natural rhythms to feel these transitions deeply. They watched animals rest and awaken. They observed cycles of decay and growth. They saw forests renew themselves after loss. From this perspective, it made sense to imagine life continuing in some form. Not as escape. But as transformation. And importantly, these ideas were not rigid. They weren't enforced. They evolved gently from observation and experience. Even today, when people reflect on life after death, they often return to images like light, movement, reunion, or rest. These aren't abstract inventions. They're extensions of what the mind already understands. Continuity feels intuitive. Abrupt erasure does not. And so, long before science or philosophy addressed the question, humans were already answering it in the only way available to them. Through care, symbolism, and quiet imagination. As we move forward, these early visions don't demand belief. They simply remind us of something subtle. That wondering about what comes next has never been about fear alone. It has always been about meaning. And about staying connected to the rhythms that shape life itself. And from here, we can gently shift forward toward how structured belief systems began to form. Not as rules, but as ways of holding the unknown with steadier hands. As human societies became more settled. As language grew more precise. And as stories were passed down across generations. Ideas about life after death began to take clearer shape. Not sharper. Just more defined. Across many early civilizations, the idea of a soul did not begin as a separate object living inside the body. It was often understood as a pattern. A movement. A breath. A rhythm that animated a person while they were alive. In ancient Egypt, the self was described as a collection of aspects. Some were tied closely to the body. Others moved freely. None existed entirely on their own. In early Greek thought, the word psyche simply meant breath. It wasn't mystical at first. It was observable. When breath left the body, something essential had changed. In parts of Asia, similar ideas appeared. Life was understood as flow. Energy moving through form. When the form could no longer hold it, the movement continued elsewhere. What's interesting is how little emphasis there was on permanence. The soul wasn't something frozen or fixed. It was dynamic. It changed. It adapted. Much like consciousness does from moment to moment. Even today, neuroscience describes the self not as a single point, but as a coordinated pattern of activity across the brain. Thoughts arise. Feelings pass. Identity shifts depending on context. There is no single place where you reside. There is only ongoing process. Ancient thinkers didn't have brain scans. But they noticed something similar through experience. A person could be present yet absent. Alive yet unresponsive. Dreaming while still breathing. These observations blurred the boundary between waking and other states. If consciousness could shift so fluidly during life, why would it be impossible for it to shift again after death? Rather than imagining a soul traveling intact from one place to another, many traditions described continuity as reorganization. A melody doesn't disappear when the instrument is set down. It simply stops being expressed in that form. This idea appears in different languages and metaphors. Some spoke of return. Others of release. Others still of dispersal. Not loss. Change. There is a quiet comfort in this framing. It removes urgency. It removes judgment. It suggests that whatever continues does not need to carry memory, or personality, or unfinished narratives. It simply continues as pattern. You may notice how this mirrors deep rest. When you sleep without dreaming, there is no story, no sense of self. And yet, you continue. Time passes. Rest occurs. Something essential is restored. The self dissolves. But existence does not. This way of understanding the soul avoids extremes. It doesn't demand belief in reward or punishment. It doesn't deny meaning either. It simply allows the possibility that life is more process than possession. And from here, it becomes easier to explore how later philosophies and emerging sciences began to approach the question from new angles. Not to replace earlier ideas, but to reinterpret them through observation and reason. We'll move there gently next, where curiosity meets restraint, and wonder learns to coexist with uncertainty. As methods of observation became more refined, the question of life after death began to shift again. Not away from mystery, but toward restraint. Science does not begin by asking what feels meaningful. It begins by asking what can be observed, measured, and repeated. And when science looks closely at death, it sees a gradual process, not a single moment. The heart slows. Breathing becomes irregular. Electrical activity in the brain changes. Then quiets. But this quieting is not immediate. Studies show that, for a short time, Patterns of brain activity can persist even after the heart stops. Not thoughts as we know them. Not awareness in a familiar sense. But coordinated signals. Fading gently. Some researchers describe this as the brain's final transition. A shift from active processing to a state of deep, spreading silence. What's striking is how calm this process appears. There is no sudden collapse. No dramatic shutdown. It resembles sleep more than disappearance. People who have been revived after near-death states often describe experiences that feel ordered. Not chaotic. A narrowing of focus. A sense of distance from the body. A quiet clarity. Science does not interpret these reports as proof of an afterlife. But it also does not dismiss them as meaningless. Instead, it notes that the brain, under extreme conditions, may enter states that feel profoundly real, deeply structured, and emotionally significant. These states don't necessarily point to another world. But they do suggest that consciousness is capable of reorganizing itself in ways we don't normally experience. Even more interesting is what science chooses not to claim. Neuroscience does not say that consciousness is permanently destroyed at death. It simply says that we cannot currently observe it continuing. In the absence of a functioning brain, that distinction matters. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Science is careful here. Not because it lacks curiosity, but because it respects limits. There are questions it can explore. How memory forms. How identity emerges. How awareness fades. And there are questions it holds open. What consciousness fundamentally is. Why subjective experience exists at all. And whether awareness is bound entirely to matter. In recent years, even physicists have begun to question whether consciousness is as localized as once believed. Some theories suggest it may be a process that arises from interaction, not a thing stored in a place. Again, not proof. Just possibility. What emerges from science is not a final answer, but a posture. Careful. Curious. Unrushed. It allows space for not knowing, without forcing closure. And in that space, old ideas and new observations are not in conflict. They sit together quietly, like two ways of describing the same horizon. From here, we can begin to explore how modern thought blends science, philosophy, and lived experience, and how these perspectives shape the way we relate to mortality. Not as an ending to fear, but as a soft boundary we all approach. We'll continue there. Gently. Without asking certainty to arrive before it's ready. Long before laboratories and brain scans, people were already observing something quietly persistent. Not proof. Not certainty. But patterns in how humans relate to endings. Philosophy has never tried to solve life after death in the way science solves a problem. Instead, it has asked a softer question. What does the idea of continuation do to the way we live? Across cultures and centuries, philosophers noticed that belief in some form of after often wasn't about escaping death. It was about making life feel coherent. Plato imagined the soul as something that learns, forgets, and remembers again. Not as a ghost drifting away, but as a traveler between states of understanding. Later thinkers were less concerned with destinations, and more with transformation. They asked whether identity itself might be a process rather than a fixed thing. Something always changing, even while we feel continuous. If that is true, then death would not interrupt identity, but complete a final transition. Social scientists noticed something similar in the way humans grieve. When someone dies, their influence does not vanish. It diffuses. Habits remain. Phrases echo. Values quietly guide decisions, long after the person is gone. From this perspective, life after death is not a single event, but a redistribution. A person becomes memory, behavior, story, and emotional imprint. This doesn't require belief in a soul leaving the body. It simply observes that human presence is never fully contained in one place. Anthropologists found that nearly every culture developed rituals around death, not to deny loss, but to slow it. Rituals create continuity. They allow the mind to adjust gradually, rather than face absence all at once. In this way, beliefs about the afterlife function psychologically like a gentle bridge. They reduce shock. They preserve meaning. They soften the sense of finality. Modern psychology adds another layer. Studies show that people who hold calm, non-punitive views of death often experience less anxiety. Not because they expect certainty, but because they allow openness. The mind rests more easily when it doesn't demand a complete explanation. What's striking is that philosophy, anthropology, and psychology converge here. None insist on a specific answer. All suggest that humans are wired to experience continuity, whether through memory, influence, or imagined extension. And this wiring appears to serve a purpose. It helps us stay oriented, connected, less afraid of change. From this angle, the question shifts again. Not what happens after death, but what continues, and in what form, and perhaps even more gently, what feels meaningful to carry forward. In the next part, we'll explore how modern theories of consciousness begin to blur the boundary between inner experience and the wider universe, and why some scientists now speak about awareness as something that may not be as isolated as we once assumed. In recent years, the conversation around life after death has shifted quietly, not toward certainty, but toward curiosity. Modern science does not claim to know what happens when consciousness ends, but it has begun to question what consciousness actually is. For much of the last century, the brain was treated like a machine. Thoughts were outputs. Awareness was a byproduct. When the machine stops, the output stops. Simple. Comfortably final. But newer research has complicated this picture. Neuroscience shows that consciousness is not located in one place. There is no single center where awareness lives. Instead, it emerges from patterns, networks, rhythms of communication. When these patterns change, consciousness changes. When they quiet, awareness fades. This raises a subtle question. If consciousness is a process, rather than a thing, What does it mean for it to end? Some scientists suggest that individual awareness may be more like a wave than an object. A wave exists because conditions allow it. Water, motion, energy. When conditions change, the wave dissolves. But nothing disappears. The water remains. The energy redistributes. This analogy does not prove survival. It simply reframes disappearance. Other researchers explore ideas like panpsychism, the proposal that consciousness may be a fundamental property of the universe, like mass or charge. In this view, individual minds are not isolated islands, but local expressions of something more widespread. Again, this does not claim personal identity continues intact. It suggests that awareness itself may not be as fragile or exclusive as once believed. There are also studies of near-death experiences, not as evidence of an afterlife, but as windows into how the brain behaves. When ordinary patterns break down, people often report expanded perception, loss of time, and a sense of unity. Neuroscientists explain these experiences through changes in oxygen, neurotransmitters, and neural synchronization. Yet even these explanations leave room for wonder, because the experiences themselves feel coherent, meaningful, and deeply calming to those who have them. They suggest that when the brain loosens its grip on ordinary structure, experience does not always collapse. Sometimes it opens. From a scientific perspective, this implies something important. Consciousness may not vanish abruptly. It may fade, transform, or reorganize, much like falling asleep. As sleep approaches, the sense of I softens. Boundaries blur. Thoughts lose sharp edges. We don't fear this loss of control. We welcome it. If death shares even a small resemblance to this process, it may be less like being switched off, and more like drifting out of focus. Science cannot confirm this, but it no longer dismisses the question. And in that openness, many people find a surprising calm. Because if consciousness is not a rigid object, then perhaps its end is not a violent break, but a gradual release. In the next section, we'll look at how time itself may influence our experience of death, and why some theories suggest that endings only feel final. From a very narrow perspective, one of the quietest ideas to enter modern science is also one of the most unsettling. Time may not move the way we feel it does. In everyday life, time feels like a river. It flows forward. Moments arrive, then disappear. The past is gone. The future waits. But physics tells a gentler, stranger story. At the deepest levels of reality, time does not behave like a flowing stream. In many equations, past, present, and future exist together. Not moving. Not passing. Simply arranged. From this perspective, the universe resembles a vast landscape. Every moment has a place. Nothing needs to rush. Your first breath, this moment of listening, and moments far beyond your lifetime, all occupy their own quiet coordinates. They do not erase one another. This does not mean we experience them all at once. Our awareness moves locally, like a lantern traveling through fog. But the landscape itself remains. If this view is even partly true, then death may not erase a life, any more than night erases a day. It simply marks where our awareness stops moving. The moments that formed you do not vanish. They are not deleted. They remain part of the universe's structure, etched into space-time itself. This idea changes how some scientists think about endings. From within time, death feels like a wall, a final moment. From outside that narrow flow, it may look more like a boundary of perspective. Not an exit from existence, but an exit from experience. This helps explain something familiar. Why memories of loved ones do not feel imaginary. Why past moments can still feel alive. Why meaning does not decay just because time passes. Because in a very real sense, those moments are still there. They are not waiting. They are not watching. They simply are. This perspective does not promise reunion or continuation of identity. It does something quieter. It softens the idea of loss. It suggests that nothing truly meaningful is ever erased from the universe. Not thoughts. Not care. Not love. Even physics supports this gently. Information, we're told, cannot be destroyed. It can change form, spread out, become difficult to trace. But it does not vanish. If consciousness is tied, even loosely, to information, then its imprint may persist far beyond the moment we stop noticing. This does not mean awareness continues. It means meaning endures. And sometimes that is enough. Because what we fear most is not non-existence, but disappearance. To know that a life was fully present, fully real, and permanently woven into the universe's structure, offers a form of peace. In this way, death may be less like falling into nothing, and more like stepping out of the current. The river continues. The landscape remains. In the final section, we'll let go of explanations altogether, and rest with the feeling these ideas leave behind. Not as answers, but as a gentle place to set down the question. At some point, every explanation reaches a quiet edge. Not a failure. Not a gap to be filled. Just a place where knowing naturally softens. Life after death, when viewed through science, philosophy, and human experience, does not arrive as a single answer. It arrives as a field of possibilities. And that may be exactly what the human mind needs. We are not built to carry certainty forever. Certainty creates tension. It demands defense. Uncertainty, when held gently, creates space. In many traditions, rest begins not with answers, but with release. The release of needing to know what comes next. The release of needing to be right. Science itself understands this posture. The most careful scientists do not cling to conclusions. They stay open, curious, patient. They know that reality is often larger than our current models. When it comes to death, this openness becomes comforting. Not because it promises something, but because it removes pressure. You do not have to imagine endless darkness. You do not have to picture another world. You do not have to decide what you believe. You can simply rest with the fact that existence has always surprised us. From atoms forming consciousness, to life emerging from silence, to awareness reflecting on itself. If such things are possible, then the unknown does not need to feel threatening. It can feel spacious. Many people report that when they stop forcing an answer, fear loosens its grip. The body relaxes. Breathing deepens. Thoughts slow. Not knowing becomes a place to rest, rather than a void to avoid. Even now, as you listen, your mind does not need to solve anything. There is nothing required of you. No belief to adopt. No conclusion to reach. Just the simple experience of being here. Aware. Alive in this moment. That experience itself is already extraordinary. And perhaps that is enough. In the next and final reflection, we won't ask what happens after life. We'll simply notice how it feels to be alive now. And let that feeling gently fade into stillness. As the conversation around life and death grows quieter, something subtle begins to happen. The mind loosens its grip. Thoughts that once felt heavy start to drift more slowly, like leaves settling on still water. You may notice that the question itself, what happens after, is no longer pressing for attention. It doesn't disappear. It simply softens. This is often how reflection ends. Not with an answer, but with a change in tone. Awareness becomes wider, less focused on edges, more accepting of gentle blur. In this state, life feels less like a timeline, and more like a presence. Breathing continues. Without instruction. The body supports itself. Without effort. And consciousness, whatever its ultimate nature, rests easily inside this moment. Many people find comfort here. Not in certainty, but in the quiet realization that being alive is already enough experience. For one night, you don't need to reach beyond this moment. You don't need to imagine an ending. You don't need to define what comes next. The mystery remains intact. And that is okay. Mystery does not mean danger. It often means depth. It means the story is larger than a single explanation. Larger than fear. Larger than thought. As this reflection dissolves, details begin to fade. Words lose importance. Images soften. The mind no longer pushes forward. There is only a gentle awareness. Like a dim light behind closed eyes. And within that light, a quiet permission to rest. Nothing more needs to be said. Nothing more needs to be known. The night can carry whatever remains. As the reflection continues to thin, what remains is not a conclusion, but a sense of ease. The mind no longer circles questions. It rests beside them. Life and death. Beginning and continuation. thought and silence. They no longer feel separate. They feel like parts of the same slow rhythm. You may notice how naturally the body understands this pace. The gentle rise of breath. The soft release that follows. Nothing needs to be resolved for calm to arrive. Understanding, here, is not something you hold. It is something you allow. Many traditions, across cultures and time, have returned to this same quiet insight. That peace often comes when we stop asking the moment to be anything other than what it is. Right now, existence is simple. You are here. Breathing happens. Awareness floats gently, without needing direction. The future does not demand attention. The past has loosened its grip. There is only this calm continuity. This soft unfolding of being. And in this space, it becomes easier to trust that whatever follows life will arrive in its own way, at its own time, without needing rehearsal. The mind does not need to stay awake to guard the mystery. It can rest too. Thank you for spending this quiet time here. If these gentle explorations bring you comfort, you're always welcome to return. Until then, rest easily, and let the night carry you.